For years, I kept my silence. There are some things so dangerous, so world-shattering, that even thinking about them too much can get you into trouble. I learned that the hard way. But now that I've reached an age where the government's threats don't hold the same power, and with no family left to protect, I've decided it's time to tell the truth. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I witnessed during my time working on Project Blue Book. You've probably heard of it, a top-secret Air Force program investigating UFO sightings during the 1950s and 60s. Officially, it ended in 1969. But I can tell you, that was just a cover. The real work continued in the shadows, and I was one of the few people who got to see behind the curtain. I started in 1957, fresh out of college with a degree in physics and a burning curiosity about what was beyond our world. I was recruited under the pretense of serving my country, and at first, it felt like an honor. They told me we'd be investigating unexplained aerial phenomena, that it was all about science and security. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. From day one, we were told not to ask too many questions. Everything we did was compartmentalized, and the higher-ups only gave us information on a need-to-know basis. Our job was to analyze reports of UFO sightings, collect data, and, this was the most important part, debunk them. We were told to discredit witnesses, explain away the strange lights and objects in the sky as weather balloons, swamp gas, or experimental aircraft. But the more reports I read, the more uneasy I became. Some of the cases didn't fit the official narrative. The witnesses weren't just crackpots or attention seekers, they were credible people. Military personnel, airline pilots, scientists. They had seen things that defied explanation, and their stories were consistent. Whatever was out there, it wasn't from this earth. It was in late 1958 that things took a turn. I had been working on Blue Book for a year when I was called into a classified briefing. Only a handful of us were present, top-ranking officers, scientists, and me, the lowest man on the totem pole. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and as soon as I walked in, I knew this wasn't just another routine meeting. The colonel in charge, a man named Reynolds, stood at the front of the room with a file folder that looked thick enough to contain a decade's worth of secrets. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice grim, "what we're about to discuss does not leave this room. If any of you so much as breathes a word of it to anyone outside of this team, I guarantee you'll disappear faster than you can blink." He wasn't exaggerating. We all knew what happened to people who crossed the line. Reynolds opened the file and pulled out a stack of black and white photos. He passed them around the table, and when I got my hands on them, my blood ran cold. The first photo showed a crashed object in the desert. It wasn't like any aircraft I'd ever seen. The hull was sleek, metallic, and oddly organic, as if it had grown rather than been built. The second photo showed the wreckage up close, with strange symbols etched into the metal, symbols that looked almost like writing, but not in any language I recognized. But it was the third photo that sent a chill down my spine. It showed a body, humanoid but not human. It was small, about 4 feet tall, with a disproportionately large head and enormous black almond-shaped eyes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were thin, fragile-looking. The corpse lay sprawled on the ground next to the wreckage, its mouth open in a silent scream. The room was dead silent as we passed the photos around, each of us struggling to process what we were seeing. Finally, Reynolds spoke again. "This," he said, "is why Project Blue Book exists, not to investigate UFOs, but to keep the truth from getting out. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. We had all suspected there was more to Blue Book than we were being told, but this was something else entirely. "Where did this happen?" one of the scientists asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds hesitated for a moment, then said, "Roswell." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. In 1947, a mysterious object had crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, and the Air Force had quickly swept in, claiming it was nothing more than a weather balloon. But now, looking at the photos in front of me, I knew the truth. The Roswell incident hadn't been a weather balloon. It had been a craft from another world, and the government had been covering it up for over a decade. That day marked a turning point for me. Everything I thought I knew about my job, about the world, was turned upside down. From that moment on, I was no longer just an investigator. I was a keeper of secrets. Secrets that, if revealed, could change the course of human history. But, as I would soon learn, Roswell was just the beginning. After the Roswell revelation, everything changed. My work on Project Blue Book became far more restricted, and the cases we were given to investigate became increasingly bizarre. The higher-ups were no longer trying to debunk UFO sightings, they were actively studying them. It was clear that they knew far more than they were letting on. One day, I was pulled from my usual duties and assigned to a secret operation. Only a handful of people were involved, and we were all flown to a remote Air Force base under the cover of night. When we arrived, I was met by a man who introduced himself as Agent Parker. He wasn't military. He was CIA. "Welcome to the real Project Blue Book," Parker said with a thin smile. "This is where the real work happens." He led us into a bunker, deep underground, far from prying eyes. The moment the doors closed behind us, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Something about this place felt wrong. Inside the bunker, I was introduced to the rest of the team: scientists, engineers, intelligence operatives. All of them hand-picked for this mission. All of them sworn to secrecy. We were told that we were about to witness something that would change the way we saw the universe. What we saw next would haunt me for the rest of my life. But that's for the next chapter. The cold concrete walls of the bunker seemed to close in around us as we followed Agent Parker through a series of dimly lit corridors. The air was stale, heavy with the unmistakable sense that we were about to witness something we shouldn't. I could feel the tension in the air, a mix of fear and curiosity swirling among the small group that had been selected for this mission. Parker's footsteps echoed off the walls, each step bringing us closer to whatever dark secret was hidden beneath the surface. My mind raced with possibilities. What could be so important, so terrifying, that it had to be buried this deep, kept away from the world? I had seen things already, things that defied explanation, but something told me this was different, much worse. Finally, we arrived at a steel door with a keypad beside it. Parker punched in a code, and with a loud hiss, the door slid open, revealing a vast, dimly lit room. The center of the room was dominated by a large glass enclosure, inside of which was something that immediately sent a chill down my spine. At first glance, it looked like a machine, a sleek, metallic structure with wires and tubes running through it. But the more I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't just a machine. There was something organic about it. The metal seemed to pulse ever so slightly, as if it were alive. "What the hell is that?" one of the other men in our group muttered under his breath. Parker turned to face us, his expression dead serious. "This is why you're here," he said. "What you're looking at is not of this world. This is the real reason Project Blue Book was created, to study them. I could feel the weight of his words sink in. I had suspected as much after seeing the photos from Roswell, but this was confirmation. There were beings, technologies, that were not from Earth, and the government had been studying them for years, maybe even decades. As Parker continued to explain the nature of the object, my eyes remained locked on it. The way it pulsed, almost like it was breathing, sent waves of dread through me. Whatever it wasn't just some piece of alien technology. It was alive in some sense, and it was watching us. This is what we call the Nexus device, Parker said. It was recovered from a crash site in 1954, deep in the Nevada desert. It's some kind of biological machine, but we've yet to fully understand its function. All we know is that it's incredibly advanced, far beyond anything we could ever create. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. This device, it's linked to something bigger, something more dangerous than you can imagine. A low hum filled the room, and the Nexus device began to glow faintly. The light wasn't natural. It was too cold, too unnatural. I could feel it in my bones, a gnawing sensation that something was deeply wrong. The device communicates, Parker continued. We've detected signals coming from it. It's trying to reach out, but we don't know to whom or what. That's why we brought you here. You're going to help us decode those signals. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I didn't want to be near that thing any longer than necessary, but I also knew I had no choice. Whatever this device was, whatever it was trying to do, it was part of something far larger than we understood. And if we didn't figure it out, the consequences could be catastrophic. The group was silent, each of us grappling with the weight of what we had just learned. I could feel my heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just some routine investigation. This was something far more sinister, and it had been hidden from the world for years. Parker motioned for us to follow him again, and we were led into a smaller room adjacent to the main chamber. Inside were rows of computer terminals, each manned by a technician staring intently at screens filled with indecipherable symbols and codes. This is the command center, Parker said. We've been monitoring the Nexus device for years, trying to understand its language, its purpose. But so far, we've made little progress. That's where you come in. We need fresh eyes, new perspectives. I glanced at the screens, trying to make sense of the data flashing before me. It was like nothing I had ever seen. Symbols that seemed almost organic, like they were alive, shifting and changing as I watched. What happens if we can't decode it? Someone asked from behind me. Parker's face darkened. We're not sure, but we've intercepted transmissions that suggest this device isn't just waiting to communicate. It's waiting for something, a signal perhaps, an activation. The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. If the Nexus device was waiting for a signal to activate, what would happen when it did? Was it a weapon, a beacon, or something far worse? Suddenly, one of the computers began to beep loudly, and the technicians rushed to their stations. Parker turned sharply, his face pale. "It's happening," he muttered. "The device, it's responding to something." I felt my stomach drop. The Nexus device was glowing brighter now, its hum growing louder and more intense. The pulsing rhythm of the machine quickened, like a heartbeat accelerating with fear. "We need to shut it down," one of the technicians shouted. Parker's voice was firm. "No, we need to see what it does." The room filled with a tense silence as we all stared at the glowing machine, helpless to stop whatever was coming. The screens flickered, and suddenly, the symbols began to shift and rearrange themselves into something terrifyingly familiar. Coordinates, a location. Parker's face drained of color as he stared at the screen. "It's a message," he whispered. "It's telling us where they are." I didn't have to ask who they were. It was the beings behind the Nexus device, the ones who had sent it here, or worse, the ones who had followed it. And now we knew where they were. But the question was, did they know where we were too? I could feel my hands trembling as the realization hit me. We had just opened the door to something we couldn't possibly understand. And whatever was on the other side was coming for us. I stared at the screen, heart racing as the symbols morphed into coordinates, flashing in a sequence that was impossible to ignore. My mind was spinning, struggling to comprehend what this all meant. The Nexus device wasn't just some piece of alien technology. It was part of something bigger, something we were never supposed to understand. And now it had given us a location, a place where they were. The room was silent except for the hum of the Nexus device, still glowing faintly in the other chamber. Parker's expression was one of grim realization. He had been hunting for answers for years, and now that he had them, it seemed like he wished he didn't. "What does this mean?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice was shaky, betraying the fear that was creeping into my chest. Parker didn't look at me. His eyes were still fixed on the screen, as if hoping the message would somehow disappear. "It means they're here," he whispered almost to himself. "Or they're coming." One of the technicians stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "This isn't what we signed up for," he muttered, his face pale. "This thing, it's communicating with something out there. We don't even know if we can control it." Another technician, a woman named Elena, leaned over her screen, fingers flying over the keyboard. "The coordinates, they point to somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, a remote location, off the grid." "Coordinates to what?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Elena turned to face me, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not just a location. It's like an invitation." Parker's face darkened further. "An invitation to what?" he asked, his voice low. "That's the thing," she replied. "I don't know, but the signal, it's been sent. We didn't just receive the message, the device transmitted it back. Whatever's out there knows we've decoded it." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. We had crossed a line that we couldn't uncross. Whatever this message was, it wasn't just information. It was a beacon, a signal sent into the dark, and now something had answered. "We need to shut this down," I said, stepping forward. "This is beyond us. We've opened something we don't understand." But Parker shook his head, a grim resolve settling over him. "We can't stop now. We've come too far. If we shut it down, we'll never know what we're dealing with." "That's the point," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "Maybe we're not supposed to know." Elena looked up from her terminal, her face pale. "Sir, there's more. I'm detecting an anomaly. It's not just the device, the signal, it's affecting the base." "What do you mean?" Parker asked, his voice tense. She pointed to her screen, where a series of erratic patterns flickered across the display. "There's interference, electrical surges all over the facility. Whatever the Nexus device is communicating with, it's affecting everything." As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered, and a low rumble echoed through the walls. The ground beneath us seemed to shift slightly, as if the very structure of the base was being disturbed. The hum of the Nexus device grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat that was quickening with anticipation. "We need to leave," one of the technicians said, panic creeping into his voice. "Now!" Parker stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "No one's leaving," he said firmly. "We need to understand what's happening here." The ground shook again, harder this time, and a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the facility. It sounded like metal tearing apart, like something had broken free. "What the hell was that?" I asked, fear gripping me tightly. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning the data on the screen. "Sir, we've got movement in the lower levels. Something's coming up." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean something's coming up?" Elena looked at me, her face drained of all color. "There's something down there moving through the facility, and it's headed this way." Parker's expression hardened, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. "Seal off the lower levels," he ordered, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need to contain this." The technicians scrambled to follow his orders, their hands shaking as they worked the controls. But it was too late. The ground beneath us shuddered violently, and the lights flickered again before plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. The air was thick with tension, every breath labored as we waited for something, anything to happen. Then, slowly, a faint light began to glow from the Nexus device in the other room. It was brighter now, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls, and with it came a sound, low and guttural like something breathing, something massive. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But before anyone could move, the steel door behind us buckled as if something enormous had slammed into it from the other side. The sound reverberated through the room, a deafening crash that sent a wave of panic through the group. Parker drew his sidearm, his face pale but determined. "Stay calm," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "We're not leaving until we know what's going on." But I could see it in his eyes. He knew, just like the rest of us, that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to stop. We had decoded the message, we had sent the signal, and now they were coming for us. Another crash shook the door, and this time the metal groaned under the pressure. Whatever was on the other side was strong, too strong. "This is insane," Elena whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her terminal. "We never should have done this." I didn't need to hear her say it. I already knew. We had tampered with something beyond our understanding, and now the consequences were coming, fast and unstoppable. With one final thunderous crash, the steel door gave way, and the darkness beyond it seemed to spill into the room. The door crumpled inward with a metallic screech, and a gust of cold air rushed into the room. It carried a strange, almost chemical scent that stung my eyes and burned my throat. In the dim glow of the emergency lights, I could see the fear in everyone's faces. This was no longer an experiment, no longer a controlled scenario. We were about to confront something none of us could have imagined. Parker stood frozen for a moment, gun in hand, his eyes locked on the gaping blackness that had replaced the door. The room was deathly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the Nexus device, still glowing like a beacon in the center of the adjacent chamber. For a split second, it felt like time had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the floor, reverberating in our chests. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and primal, like the sound of some massive creature stirring from the depths of a nightmare. I could feel it in my bones, a sound so alien and wrong that it made my skin crawl. Parker took a step back, his gun raised toward the darkness. "Whatever it is, we can't let it get into the lab," he said, his voice tight with fear. "No," Elena whispered, her eyes wide with terror as she backed away from the breach. "We need to run. We need to get out of here." Another growl echoed through the room, louder this time, and I could see movement in the shadows. It was subtle at first, just a ripple in the darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that the shadows weren't empty. Something was moving through them, something massive and crawling. Parker fired his gun, 3 quick shots into the void, but it was like shooting into a bottomless pit. The bullets vanished into the blackness, and the creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it seemed to react, its growls growing louder, more agitated, like the shots had only made it angrier. "Elena, we need to shut down the Nexus device," I shouted, grabbing her by the arm. "Whatever this thing is, it's coming for it." She shook her head, her face pale. "We can't. It's too late. The device, it's already connected to them. If we shut it down now, we don't know what will happen. It could trigger something worse." I glanced at the Nexus device, its eerie glow pulsing in time with the creature's growls. She was right. The thing was alive, and it was tethered to something beyond our understanding. But that also meant it was a beacon, drawing these creatures toward us. If we didn't shut it down, it wouldn't just be one creature. More would come. Another crash sounded closer this time. The walls of the room shook and pieces of the ceiling crumbled, falling to the floor with dull thuds. The creature was getting closer. We could feel it now, a heavy, oppressive presence pressing in from all sides, suffocating us with its sheer size. The air had grown thick with the stench of chemicals and rot, as if the very space around us was decaying under its influence. "Get back!" Parker yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. He fired again, emptying his clip into the dark, but it was no use. The creature was still coming. I grabbed Elena, pulling her away from her terminal. "We have to go. Now." Parker hesitated for a second longer, his eyes locked on the breach, before he finally turned and followed us. The 3 of us sprinted toward the far side of the room, where a heavy steel door led to the emergency exit. I could hear the thing behind us now, a series of wet, slithering sounds like something massive dragging itself through the room. We reached the door, and Parker threw his weight against it, shoving it open with a loud groan of metal. We stumbled into the narrow corridor beyond, the door slamming shut behind us. For a brief moment, there was only silence, the sound of our ragged breathing echoing in the enclosed space. But the reprieve was short-lived. The creature slammed into the door with such force that it bent inward, warping the steel as if it were made of aluminum. I could see the rivets popping out one by one, the metal buckling under the pressure. It wasn't going to hold for long. "This way," Parker shouted, leading us down the corridor. The emergency lights flickered overhead as we ran, casting our shadows in long, jagged lines on the walls. Every step felt like a race against time, the walls shaking with each impact as the creature followed us. We reached a stairwell and descended rapidly, our footsteps echoing in the stairwell as we sprinted downward, deeper into the facility. I could hear the creature behind us, the sound of its massive body scraping against the walls as it tore through the building, relentlessly pursuing us. "What the hell is that thing?" I shouted over the noise, my voice hoarse with panic. Parker shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know," he gasped, "but it's not stopping." We hit the bottom of the stairwell and burst into another corridor, this one darker and narrower. The lights here were dimmer, flickering in and out like dying stars. The air was thick and stale, and I could hear the distant hum of the facility's machinery beneath the floor. A reminder that we were still deep underground, far from any escape. Elena stumbled and nearly fell, but I caught her arm, pulling her back to her feet. She looked at me, her eyes wide and terrified. "We can't outrun it forever," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew she was right. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And we had no idea how to stop it. We rounded a corner, and suddenly the corridor opened up into a larger room. It was a storage area filled with rows of metal shelves and crates. Parker skidded to a stop, scanning the room for any sign of an exit. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a heavy metal door at the far end of the room. We sprinted toward it, the sound of the creature growing louder behind us, like the approach of a freight train. Just as we reached the door, the creature smashed through the wall behind us, its massive form filling the entrance to the storage room. It was even larger than I had imagined. A grotesque mass of tentacles and scales, its body pulsating with an unnatural light. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were glowing orbs of blackness, like twin voids staring into our souls. Parker grabbed the handle of the door and yanked it open. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Elena and me through. We tumbled into the next corridor, Parker slamming the door behind us. But the door wouldn't hold for long. We stood in the dark corridor, breathless and terrified, knowing that the door behind us was just a temporary barrier between us and the monstrous creature on the other side. The heavy, wet sound of its movement echoed through the walls, the metal groaning under its weight as it pressed against the door. It was only a matter of time before it broke through. "We can't keep running," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "It's going to catch us no matter what." Parker nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. His eyes darted back to the door, then to the long hallway stretching out in front of us. "There's got to be another way, something we can do to stop it." I glanced around, my mind racing. There were no more exits visible, just this claustrophobic corridor leading deeper into the facility. And the creature was relentless. It wasn't just chasing us, it was being drawn to something inside the lab. The Nexus device had opened a door, and whatever came through wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. "We have to destroy the Nexus device," I said, my voice steady despite the panic threatening to overwhelm me. "It's the only way. That thing, it's connected to the device somehow. We cut off the connection, maybe we can stop it." Parker frowned, his hand still gripping his weapon tightly. "And how the hell do we do that? We're cut off from the lab, and even if we weren't, you saw what happened. Shutting it down might cause something worse." Elena shook her head, the fear in her eyes giving way to a grim determination. "No, he's right. The Nexus device is the key. We don't have a choice. If we don't shut it down, more of those things might come through. It's already unstable. It's a ticking time bomb." Parker glanced at us both, weighing the options. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we get to the device. But how?" I scanned the corridor again, my heart pounding as I thought through every possible scenario. There had to be a way. We couldn't just let this thing hunt us down. Then I remembered the emergency access tunnels. During the facility's orientation, we were told about them in case of a total lockdown. They were designed as a last resort, a way to bypass sections of the lab if the main routes were compromised. "The tunnels," I said, turning to the others. "There are emergency tunnels running under the facility. We can use them to get back to the lab without crossing paths with that thing." Parker's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "If we can find an access point, that could work." Elena nodded. "It's our best shot." We didn't waste any more time. With the creature still pounding at the door, we sprinted down the corridor, searching for the nearest access hatch. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with us as we ran. After what felt like an eternity, we found it, an old rusted hatch set into the floor. Parker dropped to his knees, wrenching it open with a grunt, and a blast of stale, cold air hit us as the tunnel was revealed below. The narrow passageway was barely large enough for one person at a time, but it would have to do. "You first," Parker said, gesturing to Elena. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the door where the creature was still battering against the metal, then quickly lowered herself into the tunnel. I followed, the darkness swallowing us both as we descended into the depths of the facility. Parker came last, pulling the hatch shut behind him, just as the creature let out another blood-curdling roar from above. The tunnel was damp and cold, the walls lined with rusted pipes and wires that buzzed faintly in the darkness. It smelled of mildew and old machinery, the air thick with dust and decay. We moved quickly, crouching low as we shuffled through the narrow passage. The sound of the creature grew distant, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of our footsteps and the low hum of the facility systems around us. "Do you know where we're going?" Parker asked, his voice barely a whisper behind me. "I think so," I replied, my eyes scanning the faint glow of the emergency lights that lined the tunnel floor. "These tunnels should lead us right back to the main lab. We just need to follow the markers." I pointed to a series of faded arrows painted on the walls, each one pointing toward the central section of the facility. If my memory was right, these would lead us to a service ladder that connected to the lab's lower floor. Minutes passed in tense silence as we navigated the twisting maze of tunnels, our nerves on edge with every creak and groan from the pipes overhead. The oppressive weight of the underground passage pressed down on us, the air growing colder and more suffocating the deeper we went. But the sound of the creature had faded entirely, giving us a brief reprieve. "We're getting close," I whispered, my heart pounding with anticipation. The tunnel curved ahead and I could see the faint outline of a ladder leading up to a service hatch. Beyond that, the lab. But just as I began to feel a flicker of hope, the tunnel was suddenly filled with a low, rumbling growl. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The others stopped behind me, their eyes wide with fear. It was here. Somehow it had followed us. "How?" Elena whispered, her voice shaking. "We didn't lose it," Parker said through gritted teeth, gripping his gun. "It's been following us the whole time. It knows where we're going." I turned toward the ladder. "We don't have time. Go, now." Elena scrambled up the ladder first, her hands trembling as she pulled herself up to the hatch. I followed, my heart racing as the growl echoed closer, louder, reverberating through the walls of the tunnel. Parker came last, his gun aimed back toward the darkness as he climbed. As soon as I reached the top, I shoved the hatch open and we tumbled into the lab's lower floor, slamming the hatch shut behind us just as the growl reached a fever pitch. But it wasn't over. The Nexus device was still active, still pulsing with that strange, unnatural light in the center of the lab. And now we were out of time. The lab was a scene of chaos and flickering lights casting long, erratic shadows across the floor. The Nexus device pulsed in the center of the room, a sinister glow radiating from its core. Every pulse seemed to vibrate through the floor, reverberating in my bones. We had made it to the heart of the nightmare, but time was slipping away, and the creature wasn't far behind. Elena was the first to break the tense silence. "We have to stop it, now." I nodded, my mind racing. There was no clear path to shutting the Nexus device down, and we didn't know what would happen if we succeeded. But there was no choice. The creature wasn't going to stop until it had torn us apart. And if the device continued to run, it could bring even worse horrors through the door it had opened. Parker scanned the room, his face set with grim determination. "There's a control panel over there." He pointed toward a corner of the lab where a series of blinking monitors and switches were embedded in the wall. "We'll have to force a shutdown," I said, moving toward the panel. "But we need to be prepared for anything. If this thing goes critical—" "It's already critical," Elena cut in, her voice sharp with fear. "Just do it." I reached the panel and began typing furiously, pulling up the system's diagnostics. The screens were filled with warnings, system overloads, energy spikes, unknown anomalies. The Nexus device was destabilizing, its energy readings off the charts. I had no idea what would happen if we shut it down, but there was no turning back. Behind me, Parker stood guard, his gun trained on the door. The creature was out there, lurking in the dark, and it wouldn't be long before it found a way in. "We don't have much time," I muttered, my fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm overriding the fail-safe protocols, but it's going to take a few minutes." Elena crouched beside me, her eyes darting between the monitors and the Nexus device, which was now pulsing faster, more erratically. "What if it doesn't work?" "It has to," I said, though the doubt gnawed at me. I initiated the shutdown sequence, overriding the warnings, forcing the system to comply. The lights on the control panel flickered as the device's energy levels began to drop. A sudden crash echoed from the far side of the lab, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "It's here!" Parker hissed, his voice tense. "Get that thing offline." The door to the lab shuddered under the weight of a massive impact. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it. The creature, its enormous form outlined in the flickering light, slamming its body against the steel barrier. The door bent inward with each strike, metal screeching as it warped under the assault. Come on," I whispered, watching the progress bar on the monitor inch forward. The shutdown sequence was taking too long, and the creature was getting closer. If it broke through before we could stop the Nexus device, it would all be over. Another crash, louder this time, sent sparks flying from the doorframe. Parker fired a few rounds at the door, but it was clear that bullets weren't going to stop this thing. "Almost there," I muttered, my hands shaking as I forced the system to comply. The Nexus device flickered, its glow dimming slightly as the energy levels continued to drop. But it wasn't enough. The creature slammed into the door again, and this time, the metal buckled. "We need more time!" Elena shouted, her voice high with panic. She grabbed a metal rod from a nearby table and ran toward the door, jamming it into the frame in a desperate attempt to slow the creature down. "It's not going to hold!" Parker yelled, his eyes wild with fear. The door groaned, bending further as the creature's claws tore through the steel. Its growls echoed through the lab, a horrible wet sound that sent chills down my spine. And then, just as the creature was about to break through, the Nexus device emitted a high-pitched whine, and the lights in the lab dimmed. The energy readings on the monitor dropped to critical levels, and the pulsing glow of the device began to flicker. "Shutting down!" I shouted, my voice filled with a mixture of relief and dread. The progress bar hit 100%, and the Nexus device's core began to power down, its once blinding light fading to a dull, sickly glow. But the creature wasn't stopping. With one final, earth-shattering crash, the door gave way, and the thing barreled into the lab, its enormous, grotesque body filling the room. Parker fired his weapon, emptying the clip into its thick hide, but it barely slowed the creature down. It charged toward us, its eyes fixed on the Nexus device. "Move!" I shouted, pulling Elena back as the creature lunged forward, its massive claws slashing through the air. It crashed into the device, sending sparks and debris flying in every direction. The force of the impact knocked us off our feet, and for a moment, everything was a blur of chaos and destruction. When I opened my eyes, the lab was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. The Nexus device was sparking and sputtering, its core flickering weakly. The creature lay motionless beside it, its body twisted and broken from the collision. "We did it," Elena gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of the device winding down. "We shut it down." But as I staggered to my feet, a sense of dread washed over me. The Nexus device wasn't completely offline. The core was still active, albeit faintly, and the energy readings were fluctuating wildly. "It's not over," I said, my voice thick with fear. "The device, it's still trying to stabilize. If it fails..." I didn't have to finish the sentence. The room began to shake, the floor rumbling beneath our feet, as the Nexus device let out a low, ominous hum. "Run!" Parker shouted, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her toward the exit. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins as the lab began to collapse around us. The Nexus device was in its death throes, sending shock waves through the facility, and we only had seconds to escape. We sprinted toward the door, dodging falling debris and the sparks that rained down from the ceiling. Behind us, the creature's lifeless body was being swallowed by the chaos, crushed beneath the collapsing walls. But there was no time to look back. The entire facility was coming down. "Move!" Parker yelled again, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of destruction. We reached the hallway just as the lab behind us imploded in a cacophony of shattered glass and twisted metal. The blast wave propelled us forward, slamming us into the cold, hard floor. For a few heart-pounding moments, everything was still. The only sound was the distant crackling of fire and the groaning of the collapsing structure. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up and looked around. We had made it out of the lab, but the facility was still crumbling. The Nexus device's destabilization had triggered a chain reaction, and now the entire building was at risk of collapse. I glanced at Parker and Elena, who were both breathing heavily, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. We were alive, but we weren't safe yet. "Come on," I croaked, my throat raw from the smoke and dust. "We have to keep moving." Together, we staggered to our feet and limped down the corridor, the walls shaking violently with each step. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie red glow over the destruction. Every second felt like an eternity as we fought our way through the crumbling facility, dodging falling beams and navigating around gaping holes in the floor. After what felt like hours, we reached the exit. The door was partially blocked by debris, but with a combined effort, we managed to pry it open just enough to squeeze through. Outside, the cold night air hit us like a wall, and for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. We stumbled out into the open, away from the collapsing building, and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Behind us, the facility continued to crumble, the once imposing structure now reduced to a smoking ruin. The Nexus device was no more, buried beneath the rubble, along with whatever dark power it had been harnessing. "We did it," Parker panted, lying on his back and staring up at the night sky. "It's over." But as I lay there staring up at the stars, a gnawing sense of unease crept over me. Yes, we had destroyed the device. Yes, the creature was gone. But the Nexus had been opened, even if only briefly. We had no idea what had come through during that time, or if the door had truly been closed for good. "It's never really over," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Elena turned to look at me, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I sat up slowly, my body aching from the ordeal. The device, it was just one part of something much bigger. The creatures, the energy. It's all connected to something beyond our understanding. Destroying the Nexus device doesn't change that. Parker groaned and pushed himself up on his elbows. "You're saying this could happen again?" I nodded grimly. The door was opened once. Who's to say it won't be opened again? And next time, we might not be so lucky. We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of what we had experienced settling over us like a suffocating fog. We had survived the nightmare, but deep down, we all knew that the threat wasn't gone. It was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity. Eventually, we pulled ourselves to our feet and began to walk away from the ruins of the facility. There was nothing more we could do here. The world would go on, blissfully unaware of the horrors we had faced, of the danger that still lingered just beyond the veil of reality. As we disappeared into the night, one thought echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the truth we had uncovered. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And whatever was on the other side was still watching. The end